Hello, Tamside children. I've missed reading to you all in assemblies so much that I thought I'd make my first ever YouTube video and dedicate it to you. It's a version of Little Red Riding Hood, which is why I am squashed into my middle son's red hoodie, and it's called Little Red. Once upon a time, in a small house at the edge of a large forest, there lived a young girl and her mother. The girl's name was Scarlet, but nearly everybody called her Little Red. Red was her favourite colour. She would only eat red food and only drink red liquids, which would have painted all her skin red if her mother had allowed it, which she did not. "You are a child, not a tomato." In the summer and early autumn, that child would eat her fill of strawberries and raspberries until her mouth and teeth were stained red and her stomach ached. Her favourite piece of clothing was a red hooded cape that her grandmother had made for her. As she got taller, the cape got shorter until it no longer reached her knees. But she wore it anyway. Whatever the weather, Little Red wore her hood. "There she goes," the villagers would say to each other and smile. They enjoyed seeing a little flash of red running along the road as she played her games and ran errands for her mother. But she was usually alone. The other children in the village kept their distance. The little girl didn't really understand why. On Fridays, the girl and her mother would walk through the forest to visit her grandmother, whose own cottage was deep in the woods. Little Red liked the walk. It was peaceful and calm, with a rich, earthy smell that made her feel rooted to the land itself. She sometimes wished she could sleep out there by herself, but her mother would never have allowed it. On this Friday, however, her mother asked her to walk to her grandmother's house on her own. "I'm feeling poorly today, Pat, and I know your grandmother's not well either. I don't want her to be alone and unable to make herself something to eat. I've made a lovely red tomato soup and put it in a flask with some fresh bread. Would you please take it to her for me?" "It would take a lot off my mind to know your grandmother is safe." Little Red pondered. She didn't like her routines to be changed too much. On the other hand, she loved the forest, and the thought of walking through it alone excited her. And she loved her mother and grandmother, and she especially loved tomato soup. So it didn't take her long to say, "Yes, of course I will. Is there enough soup for me?" There was indeed plenty of soup, and as her daughter prepared to leave with a basket in her hand, her mother took her firmly by the arm and spoke sternly. "Stick to the path. It's very important to remember this. The woods are lovely, deep and dark, but it's very easy to get lost, and you must not stray from that path. Do you understand?" Little Red gently shook her mother's hand off. She did not like to be held. Of course she understood. She was good at following rules and had no doubt that she would stick to this one. She waved her mother goodbye and set off. The woods were indeed lovely, dark and deep. Within 2 minutes she was enveloped by the forest, wrapped in its beautiful green arms, her feet barely making a sound on the earthy floor. She could distinguish the songs of different birds, hear the individual humming and buzzing of insects, but none of it felt overwhelming or frightening. She felt calm and happy as she walked along. She was not even halfway to her grandmother's when she noticed a strange set of roots in the ground. The roots almost looked like long toes with furry brown bark. In the half-darkness, she reached out to touch them, but something made her stop, something like the sound of breathing. She stood still and looked up. The roots were attached to 2 trunks that emerged into one twisted torso of a trunk. The bark, like matted fur, seemed to move up and down, like breathing. Her eyes moved upwards, and there, instead of leaves and branches, she saw a face. It was staring at her intently, and she couldn't tell if it was smiling or snarling. Little Red had never seen a wolf before, and if she had, she would have never seen a wolf like this one. This was a great wolf. It seemed half human somehow. She didn't feel afraid, but she did feel surprised. "Oh, I thought you were a tree." The creature bent forward closer to her. "I am no tree." "I realise that now, but you're in my way, I'm afraid, and I need to get on. Would you mind stepping aside, please, to let me pass? I have to get this soup to my grandmother before it gets cold." "Can't you walk round me?" said the wolf in a low voice, nodding towards the woods. Little Red could have walked around, but it would have meant leaving the path, and she'd promised not to leave the path. As she explained this to the wolf, the creature bowed and stepped aside, leaving just enough room for the girl to squeeze past. As she did so, she brushed against that matted fur and smelled something surprising, something that smelled like warm milk. It made her feel somehow safe. She looked up, and the wolf smiled. "Thank you, much obliged." Little Red felt pleased with herself. She didn't really know what obliged meant, but one of the farmers had said it to her when she once opened a gate for him just yesterday, and she'd been keen to practice her new word on New Year's. The wolf nodded. "Hurry on your way, little girl. If you walk quickly, you may have enough time to stop and admire the flowers." "Oh, I don't think so," said the little girl. "I don't have much time for flowers." "These are special flowers, believe me. And perhaps it would please your grandmother if you took some of them to her." Little Red had not considered this possibility. She paused for a moment, then she shook her head. "No, I really must hurry. Thank you for letting me pass." And off she went. She was not far at all from her grandmother's house when she saw the flowers and almost dropped her basket in delight. There in the forest, as if they'd sprung up almost overnight, was a carpet of poppies, beautiful, bright red poppies. She gave a little cry of joy. She'd never seen so many. Before she knew it, she was among them, admiring them and collecting a few for her grandmother. "You don't mind, do you? You'll make us so happy." The poppies said nothing, just bobbed their heads up and down as if in agreement. She sat for a while looking around. It was as if someone had thrown 1,000 seeds of favourite all around her. She didn't want to leave. But she must, and she had a promise to keep. She sighed and packed up her basket, now loaded with flowers, and made her way back to the path and onwards towards her grandmother's house. It was almost dark when she arrived, and she was feeling both sleepy and guilty. She knocked on the door and waited for her grandmother's usual welcome. "Well, don't just stand there catching cold. Come on in." But there was no reply. She knocked a little louder. The voice that came back in return didn't sound like her grandmother at all. It was a deeper voice, but strangely familiar. "Come in, child." She opened the door and peered inside. The room was darkened, the curtains closed, and in the corner under a pile of blankets she could make out a shape that she hoped was her grandmother. "Shall I put a light on, grandmother?" "No, child, my head is hurting. Just sit beside me a while." Little Red thought perhaps her grandmother's throat was also hurting, as her voice sounded so different and coarse. As she came closer to the bed, she was struck by a smell, the scent of earth and something else that smelt like warm milk. It seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She peered in the darkness at her grandmother, who was sitting up in bed, but looking larger than usual. Even more perplexing was the fact she was wearing a hat. Who wears a hat to bed? She peered more closely. Her grandmother looked very strange indeed. She seemed to have a hairy face. Little Red stared. Perhaps this was something that happened to old people. She looked closer again. The figure in the bed moved backwards, knocking the hat slightly off her head. Out popped a large ear. My grandmother! What big ears you have!" Her grandmother deftly popped the ear back under the hat. "Ah, yes, all the better to hear you with," she murmured in that low voice. Little Red got up, pulled the curtains back a little, but when she turned around she was startled to see 2 large eyes glittering back at her. Her grandmother's eyes were like little currants normally. These were huge and they were red. For the first time in her life, the little girl recoiled from her favourite colour. My grandma, what big eyes you have!" "All the better to see you with," she muttered. Little Red moved closer. She smiled, a big smile, the kind you smile when you don't really want to smile, but it feels like the right thing to do. Her grandmother smiled back. Little Red gulped. My grandma, what big teeth you have!" She was already backing away when the wolf leapt from the bed. "All the better to eat you with," the creature growled, its teeth bared and terrible mouth wide open. Little Red stood her ground. She was too shocked to run, and even if she had been quicker, she was too cross. Her soup would now be cold. Her anger might have cost her dearly had the wolf not become so entangled in her grandmother's bedsheets and blankets. The seconds gave her enough time to grab the only thing she had to defend herself with. It wasn't much, and it was just as well she didn't have time to think. She planted her feet apart, held her arm aloft, and faced the wolf head on. The wolf looked at her, pausing for a moment in surprise. Then she leapt forward, mouth once wide open again, teeth bared. Little Red jammed the large bunch of poppies down the wolf's throat and whipped her hand back in the nick of time before the jaws clamped shut. It was enough for now. The wolf choked and spluttered, coughing up leaves and stems and swallowing furiously to clear her throat. She swiped her claws at the little girl, but the girl outdanced her, keeping her distance and hoping that the moment might arise where she could run, but she didn't need to. Within minutes, the wolf's eyes widened. She sat down, staring in wonder at the little girl. "Red," she said, and kneeled over into a deep, deep, endless sleep. The little girl hadn't intended to kill the wolf. She didn't know that the poppies contained a substance that might harm the creature, but the deed was done, and to be very honest, she was a little relieved. Then a thought struck her. Where was Grandma? Little Red frantically prodded the wolf's tummy to see if there was a grandma-shaped lump in there, but there was nothing. It took a little while for Little Red to realise there was this scraping noise coming from the back of the door of the cellar. She opened it to find her grandmother inside. "I only went down there to get you some cherry juice, my pet, and someone locked the door." "Cherry juice," said Little Red. "My favourite." Down in the forest, deep in a cave, a little wolf lay in the darkness, waiting for its mother to return. He snuffled and snuggled down into his den, sniffing for the scent of the warm milk he craved. So that's the end of a different version of Little Red Riding Hood. If you would like to innovate your own, get your parents to send it in to me at my email address, and I will do my best to read some of the ones that are sent in. And I hope you're all safe, I hope you're all well, and I miss you all.